following his previous research on the places that do not matter. To some extent, these places will now be extended from Europe to the United States. So Andrés, once again, we are happy to have you with us, and Agnieszka will say a word, perhaps some other greeting from the current director of Eurorec. Thank you. Agnieszka, want to say something? Where are you?
She has left the meeting, probably technical glitch.
Oh, she has left the meeting. Why? Well, I don't think it was kind of, it must have been some technical problem. So, the questions are going to be asked on chat, or you want to have the questions asked when you finish?
People can start leaving the questions on the chat, and then I can invite people to ask the question directly on the basis of what they have put in the chat.
And our advice is to put on the chat these questions at some later moment of the speech of Andrés, because perhaps some questions would be answered by him during his presentation. So let's refrain from putting the questions at the very beginning. Oh, Agnieszka is back. So Agnieszka, say some words to Andrés, and then we start his presentation.
I'm sorry, I had some bad connection, and yes, it is really our pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Andrés Rodríguez-Pose on our seminar. Andrés, really nice to see you. And yes, as Grzegorz said, it's our honor, and we are happy to hear your presentation under the interesting title, Golfing with Trump. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Agnieszka. Thank you very much, Grzegorz. It's a real pleasure for me to be with you, and I would like to thank you for the invitation to be at this seminar. It's a real pity for me that I cannot be with you in Warsaw in person, which have been my a big incentive to do it. But I mean, we are going to try to make the most of these virtual conditions during this pandemic, and let's hope that we'll be able to meet very soon. Second, I'm not sure I deserve all the accolades that have come mainly from Grzegorz. He's a good friend. We know each other for quite a lot of time, and I think he really appreciates my work as I appreciate his work and the work that you are all doing, Euroreg and Agnieszka and all the team. So keep up the good work. I would like to keep in the future this type of collaboration. The topic that I'm going to present is, if you allow me to do it, is very topical. It's something that has been in the news until very recently, and I'm afraid is not going to be out of the news for quite some time. Is the whole idea of the rise of populism and the factors behind the rise of populism. And I'm going to be talking about the case of the United States, but I want all of you to be thinking about how this is happening in different parts of the world, from Poland to Hungary to Spain to France to the UK, and how this might be a recurrent issue if the problems at the root of the rise of populism, anti-system voting, but more importantly, the problems at the rise of the discontent by citizens with the current system are not addressed and not addressed adequately. So let me just share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you have it there. Now you can see my screen, but I cannot see you. So I'm going to be talking directly to the computer, which is always a bit uncomfortable. And let me just start by saying that there was a prediction coming from one of the most important social scientists these days, a political scientist, Robert Putnam, that in 2000 published what had become one of the main books, one of the seminal books this century in social science, which is called Bowling Alone. What is bowling alone? Bowling alone was a metaphor for the decline in civic engagement and political participation, and in many cases in all forms of social capital, that what had become the norm in the case of the United States since the second half of the 1960s. What he argued, what Putnam argued, was that Americans were no longer, as they had done for the best of a century, bowling in clubs with friends, but were going into bowling alleys alone, because the clubs, the leagues that articulated those groups, that created that sort of bonding between people with the same sort of habits, with the same sort of hobbies, if you want, was disappearing. But what he described as bowling alone was just a metaphor for a much broader decline. And he documented very well in his book the wane in all sorts of other types of civic engagement and in social trust. There had been, in the United States, between 1965 and 2000, that can be probably extended for the period after the turn of the century, a decline in political participation, a decline in voter turnout, a decline in newspaper readership, in things like personal letter writing that Americans were very good at doing, or also in other sort of, let's say, social events like union membership or participation, church attendance, club meetings, social visiting, card playing, volunteering, you name it. The American society, as Putnam had known it when he was a child and when he was growing, was in that respect what has been disintegrating for quite some time. And this decline in civic engagement, this decline in participation, this decline in political participation coincided with another momentous change, which was the parallel rise of interpersonal inequality. That since also the second half of the 1960s, but accelerated from the 1980s onwards, what the United States had witnessed, like many parts of the developed world, was a rise in the interpersonal inequality. Something that has been documented by Raj-Chetty, it has been documented by Danny Dorling, the rise of the top 10%, the rise of the top 5% or the 1% of the population in terms of income, very often at the expense of first the lower classes and then the middle classes, the dwindling middle classes. And when you put all those two trends together, on the one hand, the decline in social capital, civic disengagement, and on the other hand, the rise of inequality, what we had was a threat to democracy. He predicted, when you put those things together, American democracy is at significant risk. And he made that prediction, and probably the idea was Putnam right? So if we fast forward 16 years from 2000 to 2016, what we see that, yes, there was a challenge to the US democratic health. It was almost unthinkable that in 2000, the United States would have elected someone who was a complete outsider to the presidency like Donald Trump. Donald Trump, who was someone who was an outsider before he was a Democrat, then became a Republican. He's been an opportunistic figure in many ways, and from being an outsider to the Republican Party, became the dominant figure in the Republican Party. And more surprisingly, even because the polls were saying that that was not going to be the case, he became president in 2016 and was within a whisker of being re-elected in 2020. But what I'm going to try to argue here is that although there has been a threat to democracy, and this is something that we have seen very clearly at the beginning of January this year with the assault by Trump supporters encouraged by the president on the US Capitol, I'm going to argue that this might not be related to the exact same forces that Robert Putnam was highlighting, that Putnam was right, that probably American democracy was more fragile than what everyone thought about. But he was probably not as right, or probably, I don't want to say wrong, but perhaps less accurate in terms of defining what were the driving forces. What I'm going to say is that the threat to democracy might not have come from the decline in social capital. It might not have come from bigger interpersonal inequality, at least at the local level, or the combination of both. But it's probably much more rooted, as I'm going to try to demonstrate, on this rise of a geography of discontent, as Phil McCann tends to affirm, this politics of resentment that were highlighted by Kathy Kramer in her book on the politics of resentment in Wisconsin, or what I call the revenge of the places that don't matter. Places that have been losing out for quite some time, that have been bypassed in many ways by political attention, increasingly by policy intervention, that have decided enough is enough. If we're not going to benefit from the system, we're going to bring the system down. And this might be something that is driving, in combination with relatively strong social capital, might be driving the surge of populism, particularly in the case of the US. So let me just start with the figures and Putnam's fulfilled prediction, the election of an outsider to the presidency in 2016. And what I'm comparing, and this is work I've been doing with Neil Lee and with Cornelius Lipp, both at the LSE, colleagues at the LSE, in which we have been looking at what we call the Trump margin. The Trump margin is, we focus much more on the increase in votes between the previous Republican candidate, a mainstream Republican candidate like Mitt Romney, who's now a former governor, former senator, and now a senator from the state of Utah. That was a perfectly mainstream Republican, let's say, candidate that reflected Republican tradition of link to business for quite some time. That was the candidate in 2012, and the increase in votes to Donald Trump in the 2016 and 2020 election. And what you can see in the 2016, which was the one that got Trump elected into office, you can see that in many places of the US, especially out west, in parts of the South, in parts of the eastern megalopolis, from Boston all the way to Washington, there was a decline in support, in Republican support for the new candidate. In this case, it was Donald Trump. But there had been a significant switch, a significant swing of voters in an arc that went all the way from Maine around the Great Lakes to North Dakota, involving the states of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that were the ones that gave Donald Trump the presidency. That it had happened in places of the US, in localities, in communities that had been declining for quite some time. Amazingly, what we see is that in 2020, despite the fact that Donald Trump lost the election by a big margin in terms of popular vote, but a relatively small margin in terms of how the vote went in some specific swing states, in those areas, the Trump margin has not declined, it has increased. And you can see that the colors, which are perfectly comparable, have become darker along that arch. And there are some other areas that have joined, like, for example, parts of the state of Nevada or southern Texas, which was a big surprise because of the big Latino population. And there's a big correlation between this Trump margin in 2016 and in 2020, albeit it has become exacerbated in 2020. So meaning that the possibility that a new candidate, that either Donald Trump in 2024 or another candidate with the same sort of nativist tendencies may emerge with this disgruntled part of the population. And the question is why? And here we go to the elements that Robert Putnam was highlighting. The first one would be the erosion of social capital. And here Robert Putnam in Bowling Alone had been warning about this idea that without at first noticing, Americans have been pulled apart from one another and from our communities over the last third of the century. That American society has become more atomized, more individualistic, and that the social capital, the gel that actually made what America was, made it, if you want to use Trumpian sort of terms, made it great in the past, had become far weaker. And that was actually putting democratic institutions in jeopardy. When we map that sort of situation, this is something that has been done by Rupashinga and colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania, and they look and measure social capital by associationism, which is what Putnam mainly associates with a social capital. And of course, you might agree or disagree with that definition. What we find is that there are parts of the US where you still have got a relatively strong social capital. Those are mainly states in the Great Plains and states, mountain states, places like Montana, places like both Dakotas, places like Wyoming, places like Nebraska, Kansas, all the way down to Oklahoma, but also to a relatively high extent in the so-called Rust Belt, this area where the biggest swing to Donald Trump took place. By contrast, you have very low, that type of social capital in the big cities. So low in New York, or you cannot see it here, but in Los Angeles, in the Bay Area. You can also find it that it's relatively low in many parts of the South, especially the states of Kentucky and Tennessee, and especially out in the Southwest, all the way from New Mexico to Southern California, where this is relatively low. So what we have is significantly strong contrasts that do not necessarily match with the geography of the swing to Donald Trump. The second factor is, going back again to Putnam, is interpersonal inequality. And this whole idea of this wealth polarization in American society, that highlighting that the gap between the rich and the poor in the United States had been increasing for the best of 3 decades and has been continued to increase since the turn of the century, which has been the longest sustained increase in inequality in at least a century. And this is something that is corroborated by, as I said before, many other types of research from economists and also from geographers and political scientists. And this is creating an army of people that are left behind, people that are losing out, that are in precarious jobs, that are at risk of falling into poverty, and that as a result, they are increasingly rejecting a status quo, according to Branko Milanovic, that has eroded first their purchasing power, has eroded their dignity, and is leading to an erosion of democratic institutions, leading to greater nativism and plutocracy, as has been highlighted not just by Milanovic, but by quite a few scholars that have studied into the economic roots of the rise of populism and anti-system voting. And when we look at that situation in the UK and in the US, what we find is that interpersonal inequality, although it has been rising, there are significant differences. It is highest in the south of the US, especially in those areas of the US where you have significant Black minorities that are disadvantaged in states like Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, parts of the state of Florida, but also in big cities. You have huge levels of inequality in places like Los Angeles. You have here, although it's much more difficult to see in San Francisco, you can see here the color, the very dark color in Chicago, but you have them within the New York metropolitan area, and you have it in Boston, for example. By contrast, many of the areas of the Rust Belt, but also places in the Great Plains and mountain states, you have far lower levels of interpersonal inequality. That's, for example, the case in most of rural Indiana, rural Ohio, but also many parts and whole swaths of Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, and all the way out west to Utah and Nevada. And very often, if we follow Putnam, it should be the combination of both. If you have more inequality, and on the other hand, you have lower social capital, then the expectation is that you're going to have more discontent, and discontent is going to be translated into political upheaval and political revolt at the ballot box, especially by voting for anti-system candidates like Donald Trump was. So following Putnam, you can say that there's this every reason to think that the twin master trends of our time, less equality and less engagement, reinforce one another. Thus, efforts to strengthen social capital should go hand in hand with efforts to increase inequality. So he has a clear recipe. If our democracy is in danger, the solution is let's make our social capital stronger and let's reduce our inequality, and that would probably address the problem. I'm positing there's another factor, which is decline, and not decline that is recent decline, but long-term decline, because this is one of the great factors, one of the great neglects of Putnam's work. Putnam's work, and Bowling alone, is about all sorts of declines. We mentioned decline in letter writing, decline in church attendance, decline in political participation, decline in trade union membership, decline in volunteering and charitable giving, all types of decline. But the one that is conspicuously absent is the one that, for me, as a geographer, was the most striking. That of Midtown and rural America, the idea that wealth had been increasingly accumulated in let's say the big cities, the coasts, all the way from Boston to Washington, and even going down to places like Charlotte, all the way along the Pacific coast from Seattle to San Diego in the south. But there had been a hollowing out of economic activity and therefore wealth in many parts of the industrial sites that were the economic motors of America not that long ago, that led the American Industrial Revolution and led the transformation also of America in the post-war period. And this is a type of decline that has been documented in other parts of the world. The work of Phil McCann, Bart Loss, Frank Van Oort, and colleagues, Mark Thiessen, for example, in the UK and the Netherlands on the Brexit vote goes very much into this type of decline. The work that I have done with Louis Dijkstra on the whole of the European Union also documents this type of decline. To a less extent, this is something that has been done in the US, but we have the work of more qualitative work by Kathy Kramer and Woodnow, for example, on the case of the declining communities in the US and their revolt against the system. And when we take a look at how this has happened, we can have to document employment change. And we can see here, there can be different types of decline. It can be demographic, it can be in terms of income, in terms of wages, in terms of earnings, in terms of employment. Here I take one as a proxy, although later on I'm going to expand and fan out into different types of decline. And this is the change in employment in the US by county between 1980 and 2016. Dark colors means that there has been a significant rise in employment. And you can see what I was saying before. There has been a massive concentration on the Pacific coast, all the way, I mean, San Diego, but you can go all to south in Arizona to the northern part of Washington state on the border with Canada, along the megalopolis on the northeast from Boston to Washington, in the southern tip of Florida, so all the way from Miami to Jacksonville, Orlando and Tampa, and then around Lake Michigan, especially around Chicago up to Milwaukee. By contrast, you had relatively low levels of growth and employment in a big axis that expands from the Canadian border in North Dakota and Montana all the way down to the Mexican border in Texas, and also relatively low in parts of the South, rural Georgia, Kentucky, but also places like Arkansas and Mississippi. So the idea is, when you have these three dimensions, if you combine them, which are the ones that are driving this vote for Trump? And rather than put a model with Greek letters, I have simplified it here. What we are trying to do, and Neil, Cornelius, and myself were trying to do, was to explain the Trump margin, the excess vote to Donald Trump from the previous 2012 election. So from a mainstream candidate, so highlighting that additional voters might have been swung by this appeal of populism coming from Donald Trump, which is a factor of our three key elements, the two that Putnam highlighted: social capital, the idea of being together in associations like bowling clubs, the level of inequality, and whether local inequality actually matters in deciding how unhappy you are with the system, and long-term economic change, proxied by fundamentally starting with employment change, but we also look at population change. We look at a change in earnings per worker, and we look at changes in wages and salaries. And of course, the rise of populism, the rise of Trumpism, if you want, is not just related to these factors, it's related to a lot of other factors. So we control for a number of issues that have been highlighted in the literature as factors that can be drivers of the rise of discontent and the rise of anti-system voting in different parts of the world. And we have included the wealth of the county, racial composition, the percentage of whites or the percentage of blacks, levels of education that has been highlighted again and again, especially in the case of Europe by people like Goodwin, as one of the key factors, age, which appears as highly significant, levels of density, and there's a very nice piece of research by Jonathan Rodden at Stanford University in a book that he published in 2019 about the role of density, particularly in the US, on Trump vote and anti-system votes. Let's say, marital status of individuals, because it has been highlighted that married people tend to be happier and therefore less prone to anti-system vote. The so-called China shock that people like David Autor and Colin Donnie and Stanek have been highlighting for quite some time. And of course, there's an error term, which is what we cannot explain with this model. And before I go into the results of the model, I just want to highlight what are the correlations between the three key factors and our Trump margin, both in the 2016 and in the 2020 election. And what we get here is simply that in general, there's not a strong individual correlation. It's not that a single factor can actually determine the drive towards the Trump margin. It's not inequality alone. It doesn't seem to be social capital alone, because you can see that although there's in the case of inequality, more unequal places seem to vote more, less for Trump than more, but the regression line is mainly flat, as it is in the 2020, although the slope increases marginally. And the same applies with social capital, in which the slope is fundamentally flat and it doesn't change that much. And there's more of a negative slope in terms that places where you have seen the biggest increase in employment over the last 4 decades, the last 40 years, are more likely to vote for mainstream, less vote for Trump, less swing to Trump, than places where employment growth has been significantly lower or even negative. But the same can be said about the correlation between our 3 variables of interest: inequality and employment change, inequality and social capital, and employment change and social capital, in which you can see that the correlations are very limited. So in general, it's not that a single factor is the key determinant, but how about the combination of all these 3 factors together with all the others that have been identified by previous scholarship as driving this support for anti-system voting, and in the case of the US, the support for a candidate like Donald Trump. So what are the results that we get? And again, I could try to put a table. If you are interested, the paper is available, the previous version without the 2020 results already. Hopefully the paper with the 2020 results will be ready and accepted soon. But we get results. I'm just going to guide you. If anyone is interested, just send me an email, or I can send the paper, and I suppose it can be posted online by the organizers. So what determines the Trump margin? And here, where we find is something that is very interesting. First, the main hypothesis that I wanted to defend is that economic decline, in this case, employment decline, matters. That the swing of votes to Donald Trump was highly connected to levels of economic decline measured by employment decline between 1980 and 2016 or 2020, and that the places that saw a lower increase, so a bigger relative decline in employment, were the ones that actually had the biggest swing to Donald Trump. And this was very much connected to social capital. But if you remember from previous slides, when I was putting my social capital, indication, which was these roles, there were in the right direction. Now I put them upside down. Why do I put them upside down? Because it's not low social capital that is connected to higher votes for Donald Trump. Remember that the low social capital, mainly in the way it is defined by Robert Putnam, mainly was found in the big cities or in the south of the US. It's precisely the places with the highest social capital in combination with significant economic decline, long-term economic decline, the ones that gave Donald Trump the presidency in 2016, and the ones that almost gave it back or re-elected Donald Trump in 2020. Social capital is highly significant in 2016. It becomes insignificant in 2020. So mainly more than re-electing is, you can see that it is the combination that led to the election of Donald Trump. By contrast, inequality, once you control for a lot of other factors, you control for social capital and you control for economic change and or demographic change, and plus race and education and age and all the other factors that I mentioned before. What we find is the opposite of what Putnam was predicting, that places that have seen the biggest, that have the biggest inequality in the case of the US, the big cities, are the ones that voted less for Donald Trump in 2016. The places where there's lower inequality, more social capital, and longer term decline are the ones that voted and swung to a far greater extent for Donald Trump in 2016. That has become less pronounced in the 2020 election, in which the key factor that remains is long-term economic decline, as social capital and both levels of inequality play a more subdued, a smaller role. In terms of the controls, you'll have to believe me, but you can see the paper. We get what is expected. There's some convergence, so poorer places. Sorry, not there's some convergence. In terms, there's levels of education, less educated counties voted or swung to a great extent to Trump. Countries with counties with a bigger percentage of whites or with a smaller percentage of black population also swung towards Trump. When you have a higher dependency ratio, then you have a tendency to swing towards Donald Trump. Counties that had been more affected by the China shock, by trade with China in previous years, also voted more for Trump. Countries with a higher percentage of marriage population voted less for Trump. So all that goes along with expectations. What doesn't go along with expectation is mainly the social capital and the inequality once you control for long-term economic decline. And we also look at different types of decline. And here we find that there are two types of decline which are different from what I found in Europe, in the case of Europe, when I did the work with Louis Dijkstra, but is that it's not just employment change, so relative decline in employment, but also relative and absolute decline in population, so demographic decline, are the two factors that seem to be that have the closest connection with the election of Donald Trump. By contrast, we also control for earnings, and we also control for wages and salaries. There, for the 2016 election, we find no connection whatsoever. There's some change that I'm going to show you in for the 2020 election. And this is what we find over time in all these three dimensions. What I want to highlight is that in terms of the role of economic employment decline and population decline in relative terms, in most cases, but in some cases in absolute terms, what we find is that this is not a new phenomenon. This is not something that was triggered by the 2007-2008 crisis, by the Great Recession. It's not something that is recent, that started in the previous 8 years before the election of Donald Trump in 2016. It's something that comes from a long time ago. But it builds like a snowball. It becomes bigger and bigger and bigger the more you decline over certain decades. We have repeated the exercise, controlling for employment decline, for demographic decline, and declines or change, not necessarily decline, change in earnings and wages and salaries since 1970 until 2016 or 2020. So we have a period of 50 years, 40 years of decline, 30 years of decline, 20 years of decline, and 10 years of decline before the elections. And what we find is that regardless of the period you consider, if you have a relative decline in employment, your county is far more likely to vote for Donald Trump in both elections. And the same is reproduced in with respect to demographic decline. So these are two factors that are highly consistent. The more it accumulates, the coefficients are stronger for 2010 than they were for 1970, but in all cases, they're highly significant, and they're highly significant at the 1% level, indicating that long-term economic and demographic declines are very often, which are collective in most cases, very often related to a greater discontent that gets transferred then to the ballot box and the election of Donald Trump. By contrast, when we look at changes in earnings and changes in wages and salaries, what we find is that for the 2016 elections, they don't matter. They're non-significant. So very often people do not buy, if their salary, their personal perception, their salary is declining or their wages are declining in relative terms, that doesn't seem to affect their voting patterns as much as if they see their community, so the demographic change, lose out. If they see that there's more destruction in terms of employment and that these people cannot have an alternative. The 2020 election brings in this respect a more complex panorama because, in fact, what is interesting is, especially in the cases not of earnings, but in the cases of wages and salaries, we start having positive coefficients, that people where you have seen a bigger increase in wages might tend to vote more for Donald Trump in the 2020 election, but only in places where you have significant relative decline in employment and in demographic conditions, and once you control fundamentally for levels of social capital and also for levels of inequality. Okay, so what can we conclude from all this? Let's take stock of some of the key features of the presentation. The first one is that it seems to be that the long-term economic and demographic decline of what were the tightly knit American communities, the places with the strongest social capital, that are those that have driven the swing towards Donald Trump and seems to be driving populism and potential alternative candidates like Donald Trump in the future in the US. That this long-term economic decline has created a significant malaise, a significant discontent, maybe a resentment that goes well beyond the crisis, and that has its roots deeply embedded in the decline of the traditional manufacturing system, Fordist system that was set up in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and that flourished through the post-war years, but has been on a demise since the 1970s, especially since the 1980s in the case of the US. But it is necessarily this decline where, in order to mobilize, because it's not the poorest of the poor in the US live in the big cities. The biggest inequalities are between the center of Philadelphia, let's say the ghettos of northern Philadelphia, where you have some of the poorest people in the US, very often Black minorities in ghettos, and the parts of the suburbs, the very rich suburbs in West Philadelphia, where you have some of the richest individuals in the US in fantastic mansions. These people all voted for Hillary Clinton, and then they voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, and then they voted for Joe Biden in 2020. It is much more, rather than individual decline, the collective decline of relatively cohesive communities where there's still a relatively strong social capital that have been driving the process of the rise of populism in the US. The rise of interpersonal inequalities, which has been prominent and is becoming a big problem. We've seen it in developments in the last year, is something that might explode in the future, but at the moment is not doing so. It's amazing that in a country within the developed world like the US that has got very high in relative terms interpersonal inequalities and very low in relative terms in comparison to what we see in Europe, in comparison to what we see in Japan, for example, in comparison to what we see especially in the developing world. It has very low territorial inequalities. It seems to be that the rise of territorial inequalities triggered by the decline of once prosperous places has been far more relevant so far in the rise of anti-system voting than what has been determined by the high levels of interpersonal inequality. And therefore, it is this decline of American communities that have seen far better times, that have been dismissed very often, unfortunately, by Hillary Clinton as deplorables, as people living in a Rust Belt, in redneck areas, or in flyover states. Check the language. So elite groups on both coasts highlighting these are places where you only have rednecks and you fly over, you never stay there, are the ones that have decided we are going to make ourselves count. We've been told that we don't matter, but we are going to show that we matter. And if we're not going to benefit from the system, we're going to wreck it. And the way to do it is by exacting our revenge at the ballot box. So what can we say? These communities are no longer bowling alone. And I'm going back to Putnam here. They are now not bowling because Trump, as far as I know, doesn't bowl. They are golfing with Trump. They have found a champion, someone that has decided that he wants to shake the tree. And it's not that these voters are uneducated or they are under an illusion that things are going to change. I don't think that the voters in 2016 in West Virginia believed for 1 minute that Trump was going to reopen the coal mines. They probably knew that that was not going to happen. But they said, if we are suffering, we're going to show that at least there's someone that can pay attention to first our pleas and perhaps also create conditions that are not always going to benefit the same people that have been benefiting on both coasts until now, and is going to create a more level playing field. So this is the risk, that unless this problem and the problem of long-term economic decline and as a result of that rising inequalities, I would say interpersonal, but the results here show clearly interterritorial inequalities are not addressed and are not addressed adequately by whoever is in the administration, you'll have an even bigger share of American communities that will continue to play golf with Donald Trump, which is in 2024, or not necessarily with Donald Trump, will play golf with Trumpism and their heirs, or with whoever is perceived to pay attention to them and to promise to reverse the neglect and the perceived disdain that they seem to have suffered on the basis of what has been a distant and very often aloof economic and political elite, not just in the United States, but also in large number of our countries. So, thank you very much for your attention. If you want to get the paper, you can get it directly from here. But if you cannot find it, I mean, there are several versions of the paper. You can type the name also on Google, but you cannot find it. You can send me an email, and I'll be very happy to send it to you. All right. So thank you very much for your attention. Let me see if I can stop sharing the screen and then go and recover you. I hope you managed to hear me.
There are some similarities and some differences with Europe, definitely, because the States is a very distinctive country. I have put a comment, a question on the chat, and there are some other questions appearing. So perhaps you can reflect, react to some of them. Sorry for a long long text, but there is end if these promises that you mentioned at the end can be ever fulfilled. I think the end of my question got lost somewhere.
So, Georg, why don't you start by asking your question then in direct, and then we can go down the list. Rather than rather than me reading, just go and ask your question.
Should I read the question now, you think? Yeah? No. Well, I have some worries if it's possible to influence social capital, if it's possible to influence the economic prosperity of some remote and forgotten regions like Appalachia, for example. You showed that Appalachia hasn't changed much along with some other regions of the States. And to this reason, I think that the promises that would be given by any candidate for a president or for a governor and so on would not be able to be fulfilled because public policies cannot influence the economic social reality as they would expect to be able to influence. So I think it's a kind of determinism that has to go on not only in the States but also in Europe and in some other countries like Poland, for example. So that's my worry, that's my question.
Okay, thank you very much. No, I agree with you, and I think there are two dimensions and how this has been dealt with. First is, can we stem the decline of all places, and is it from an economic perspective something that we can support, or do we have to do other things? I mean, in the US debate, there have been some discussions. One is, let's change the electoral system. And because a vote in West Virginia or a vote in North Dakota counts far more than a vote in California, which is the largest state. They also, each state has got 2 senators, regardless of whether you are, let's say, Wyoming and you have 500,000 people, or you're California and you have 45 million people. So in that respect, there might be that path, but I don't think that addresses the problem. First, it's politically very difficult, because you would imply that you have to do the reforms through a chamber in which, let's say, those that are going to lose out are bigger or in share in numbers than those that are going to benefit. So probably more than even easier to change than changing the political system and the electoral system is to go into the roots of the problems. Does this necessarily address or imply that you have to provide development for every single place, that you have to go, as you were saying in your question, to the most remotest parts of Appalachia and bring that to the living standards that you will see, let's say, in Los Angeles or in central Chicago? The answer would be, I don't think that anyone is expecting that. But the problem is far greater than that. It's not just affecting small, low densely populated rural areas. It's affecting medium-sized cities, places like Buffalo, places like Cleveland, places like Toledo, Ohio, even places like Detroit, with the exception that Detroit is still, I mean, the centers of those cities are still voting for the Democrats. Those are where the main problems are arising, and they are a significant part of the population. It's also affecting increasingly, as Jonathan Rodden has demonstrated, the suburbs of big cities. That once you get into less densely populated suburbs, the second rim of the city, you are almost everywhere in Trump territory. And these are places that it's not that they don't have potential, they have got significant potential. But much of that potential has been overlooked. And they have seen their services decline very much in the way, for example, that has happened in the north of France, or the so-called diagonal, where the The Gilets jaunes seem to be appearing, but not just that. They have the perceived neglect that all legislation, all intervention, all policies tend to favor a particular group that is a group that is still declining in the case of the US. It's also possibly declining in the case of Europe, that gets or reaps all the benefits while they're losing out. Very often what it would imply is improving certain access to services and concentrating services and delivering those services in a much more cost-efficient way. Because when you take a look, very often the cuts in terms of austerity in Europe have affected those areas that have lost out the most, and therefore they're losing out. So in that respect, it might not just imply saying, let's subsidize. Many of these places in Europe, this is what is being proposed. If you read the work of Ed Glaser and Larry Summers on the topic, they're saying, let's subsidize these places. They have got no future, so the only one they want to do is subsidy. But this is something that we have done in Europe for the last 40 to 50 years. The south of Italy has been massively subsidized, and the question is, are they happy about it? No. The case of Corsica in France. Corsica is the region with the worst economic performance in France over the last 40 years, if you exclude the dom-tom, the overseas territories. In Corsica, 50% of the population, the working population, works in the public sector. And the question is, are they happy? And the answer is no, because they are voting for anti-system populists that are pro-independence. So in that respect, subsidies alone do not work. It's the same in the north of England. So there are big transfers from the south to the north, and no one is happy in the south, no one is happy in the north as a result of that. What you need is to create sustainable and viable, help create viable economic activity in those places, and that implies harnessing the potential of many of these areas, because these areas have got potential. And let us not forget that, for example, in the case of Europe, some of our biggest and most dynamic and most successful firms don't hail from the big cities. They come from small, relatively small places. 2 examples: IKEA in Sweden, the largest furniture company in the world, didn't come from Stockholm, it didn't come from Malmö, it didn't come from Gothenburg. It came from Anshult, a place of today 8,000 people. It was about 3,000 people when it was founded in the 1950s. Or the largest apparel company, the textile company in the world, Inditex, with Zara, which is a Spanish company. It doesn't come from Madrid, or it doesn't come from Barcelona, 2 big cities. It does come from the outskirts, a place called Arteixo, of a declining mid-sized city, which is La Coruña. And there's potential there. The only problem is that very often that potential is overlooked, not harnessed. And whether it's for real or perceived, these people are being perceived that they are neglected. Okay, I hope I have answered, it was too long, but I hope I have answered your question.
Thank you. You strengthened my worries and my kind of disbelief in external public policies directed to regions and localities, because progress or development may have happened from bottom up, from by itself, by some kind of chance, by some kind of accident, a positive accident, and not being influenced by external public policies from the federal or national level. So I very much follow your argument. I agree with it. And you follow my agreement.
Yeah, okay, thank you. There's a question by Katarzyna. Yes, go ahead. If you...
Okay, and so Katarzyna, could you ask the question now, please? Katarzyna Wojnar.
Yes, thank you. Taking that the Trump margin indicator that you proposed is an indicator of a long-term relative deprivation, and shows lack of strategies and lack of perspectives that leads to desperation. How do you see both theory and causal relationship between the Trump margin and also the opioid pandemic? the opioid pandemic maps, as I can see, both progressive, so showing the revelation of pandemic across timeline, but also the territorial shape of the opioid pandemic is surprisingly similar to what you have shown in your maps. Therefore, yeah, I would like to ask you about the territorial and causal relationship between voting for Trump and the opioid pandemic, which supposedly affects especially the white population in the US.
Okay, so thank you very much, Georgina. I think this is a very important question, and I have to start by saying that I haven't studied the opioid pandemic. It's not one of the factors that I control, but I think it's very interesting, and it's another factor. So I'm not going to be able to talk about causal relationships here, but it's another factor of this rise of hopelessness, if you want, in many parts of the US, which is fundamentally affecting white people. You have the paper by Angus Deaton as well, now on the rise of suicides in many of these places among white citizens. So people that had something or were part of something or were prosperous, thought that they were contributing to do something, and they have lost a sense of meaning. And there are different types of reactions of this. Once you are no longer the center of the universe, once you realize that your role individually and collectively is much more diminished than what it was, you start with songs like the songs that the boss, Bruce Springsteen, used to sing in the 1980s. And then you continue with a successive decline of perception, self-worth, and with a reaction that might be, on the one hand, with hopelessness that might end up with health problems, alcoholism, drug addiction, and opioid pandemic, suicide, as Angus Deaton was highlighting, but also with things need to change and try to react. And the way that is, they have to react where they count more than in any other way is through the electoral system. So I think there are two sides of the same coin, and studying that sort of relationship is something that would be very, very interesting.
Okay. And now I'm asking Dorota Celińska-Janowicz.
Yes, hello. I would like to ask about the role of the fake news, Russian trolls, conspiracy theories like QAnon. Do you think that they are somehow related with your independent variables, that people who live in these communities are more open to such theories or communication?
Okay, I'm not sure how to answer this, and thank you. This is a question that I get asked many, many times. The Russian trolls, the fake news, etc. Today, people have got more access to news and more sources of news from a broader spectrum. It's true that very often we tend to read the newspapers that are in line with our let's say, political alignment. We tend to follow on social media the type of people that would reinforce our views, but we are exposed to a lot of different types. We're bombarded by different types of views almost everywhere on a daily basis. Fake news and fake media play a big role in this. But I do think that it probably has been overstated, because that would imply that there are people that are gullible, that are uneducated, and therefore can be subject to manipulation. We're all subject to manipulation, but we all have our ways of finding alternative sources of information. And one important thing is I want to highlight that these people might be, in many cases, many of the voters for anti-system parties, both in the United States, but also in Europe. They may be less educated on average than the voters for mainstream parties, but they are not stupid. They know what they're voting for. And yes, I don't think that many people in the US, even the ones that are diffusing that, would believe that Hillary Clinton was running a pedophile ring out of a pizzeria somewhere on the East Coast, to be honest. They know what they're voting for. And I'm going to give you an example. You could argue that in the case of the UK, and I mentioned the case of West Virginia, but in the case of the UK and the Brexit vote, the people in Sunderland that depend very, very highly on the Nissan plant and the whole conglomerate around the Nissan plant, and that they were putting their jobs in jeopardy, you could say that in 2016, they did not know what they were voting for, that their livelihoods were going to lose out as a result of voting for Brexit, because the main market for the Nissan plant is Europe. In 2019, after 3 years of being bombarded by all sorts of information and a lot of studies explained in a very clear way, also on site, of saying, look, you're going to be the first ones to be stricken, that the whole area of the east of England is going to suffer much more because you're much more integrated with Europe than London. What did they vote in 2019? They voted for Boris Johnson and hard Brexit. Were they saying we're not going to suffer the consequences? No, they say they knew, but whether we lose our jobs today or we lose them in 3 years' time, it doesn't matter. The thing is that we're going to shake the tree, and we're going to show you people in London like me that we matter, and you can still feel the suffering that we have been suffering for quite some time. And that's what they're voting for. And of course they have done it, because now the result is that they're going to lose out, but they were going to lose out anyway. Now the problem is for the people in London that are seeing that they're losing out, because there's going to be less job opportunities, the price of our houses is dropping, because people have left. The talent that was brought by Polish migrants and migrants from other parts of Europe and other parts of the world is disappearing, and is disappearing very, very fast. And this is something that they say, well, fine, so be it. But this is a revenge in many ways. You have ignored us, so now you're going to feel the pain. So I don't think that they are stupid. I think they know what they're doing, but the question is that they were desperate, and that's what we haven't addressed.
Okay, now we have, sorry for my pronunciation, Zakin Perez with the question on social capital. Are you there? Would you like to ask the question?
Andrés, maybe you can read that question by yourself.
All right, so fine. It's always better to see the people and.
Okay, the microphone.
No,
gentleman disappeared somewhere.
All right, I'll read the question. So it's a question by Shaquin Perez-Indin Lopez, who's probably with that name, from the same region of Spain as I am, from the Northwest.
Thank you.
And yes, and thanks for the presentation, really insightful. Quick question. What types of social capital are taken into consideration in the index? Is it bonding social capital, bridging social capital, formal capital, or rather all of them? Which one seems to be higher in pro-Trump regions? Thank you for looking forward, and looking forward to reading the paper. Here, what I'm taking is the measurement, and you have to realize that in order to get this sort of indicators of social capital for more than 3,000 counties, in the US, we all have to rely on what has been done by others. And this is the work of Rupa Singha and colleagues, in which they set up to map the sort of social capital that was actually put forward by Donald Trump, which is mainly an associational type of social capital, is formal associations in, let's say, Putnam type of associations, which are general associations like bowling clubs that haven't got an economic purpose, but also Olson types of associations, which are associations that are very much connected to other types of more economic purposes, like trade unions, like employers' confederations, like, for example, any sort of chambers of commerce, etc. So this is what is being mapped. It's mainly social capital defined as associationism. Of course, it has been argued that Robert Putnam's definition of social capital is a very reductionist definition of social capital, which is very much linked to individual perceptions or association, traditional perceptions of social capital, that you, in order to meet people, in order to interact, what you need is to belong to something, to belong to a club, to belong to a rocket club at school, or to belong to a bowling club or to a sports club, to belong to a debating club, to belong to some sort of golf club, or to belong to some sort of broader community, like meetings in church and meetings in social gatherings. Of course, it overlooks all the types of social capital. The social capital that we all have by interacting. Poles in general interact less with one another than Spaniards, and that might have consequences. We're not sure whether that's good or bad, but this is something that is not measured in this type of indicator. We are not measuring, for example, other factors that are related to social capital, like, for example, relationship on social media, which is something that is relatively new, was not existent when Trump was writing Bowling Alone. Putnam was writing Bowling Alone, and therefore was not included in his definition, but is something that, especially now during the pandemic, that's how I do most of my networking, is either through WhatsApp or through Twitter or through Facebook and the like. And those are things. There are other measures of social capital that are associated, whether it is the whole division that Putnam had about bonding and bridging is not included here, because it's very difficult to know whether this groups of associations, whether you're in a part of a bowling club, is always bonding, or you have people because you play in a league with other people that are different from you, and that might lead to bridging. So in general, it's a relatively limited definition of social capital that is linked to belonging to groups, belonging to associations, which might be part of bonding, and it's fundamentally bonding, but it might also be part of bridging social capital.
Okay, thank you. And now it's time for my question. I just wanted to continue your discussion with Grzegorz, and I'd like to ask you, what do you think, or do you think that smart specialization policy in EU has the power to boost this potential of places that don't matter? And what is the alternative for the US?
Okay, I'm going to thank you very much, Agnieszka. I think that's an interesting question, and I'm going to tell you in theory and in reality. For many years, I thought that the top-down European regional development policy was not delivering the best return. So I've been a strong advocate of more than place-based, I would say place-sensitive type of development strategies. So that is strategies that would be informed by solid theory and empirics, strategies that would be based on sound analysis, but that would actually give enough leeway for adaptation to the conditions in places, regions, localities, cities, towns that face similar challenges, rather than just going for a free-for-all of place-based and doing a different policy in Lubielskie from what you're doing in Podlaskie and for what you were doing in Pomorskie. You do groups of regions and with leeway for adaptation. And I think, in theory, this should work. This should address many of the issues that we are discussing. That the problem is how this has been done in Europe, or has been done in Europe, that it was done relatively quickly in a very short period of time, with adaptation, with a lot of teething problems, and with limited resources. So I have just a paper that has just appeared in the Journal of Common Market Studies with Vasilis Monastiriotis and Marco Di Cataldo, one from Venice, the other one from the LSE, in which we analyze the strategies that have been implemented in the case of Europe, and we find that there's very little adaptation of those strategies to the actual conditions and problems of specific regions, and there's a lot of mimicking, copycat of what has been done somewhere else. So in theory, when this sort of approach, more place-sensitive, but perhaps also place-based approach improves, it would probably deliver, but it's not going to happen overnight, and it's probably not going to happen right now with the way the smart specialization strategy was designed and is being implemented in the case of Europe.
Thank you. And now we have a question from Piotr Miszczuk.
Okay, thank you. So my question is, do you think that there is any way for the Democrats to change this distribution of votes? Is it anything that they can do in the near future, or it will stay like this for the next, I don't know, maybe 100 not years, maybe not 100 years, but at least a dozen years?
Thank you, Piotr. I think your guess is as good as mine. This is a very interesting question, and I don't have a crystal ball here, but there's something that is very curious. That it is funny that a party like the Democrat Party, that normally took into consideration the plights and the concerns of those left behind, or those that were in favor, that were losing out from any sort of transformation, has become, in many ways, with the exception of minorities, the party of the elite. Whereas in declining places, the Republican Party, that was traditionally the party associated with the money, with the big firms, with the big industry, has become the party of the destitute. You might say that the Republican Party in 2020, a party dominated by Donald Trump, is completely different from the party that was there in the 1950s, 1960s, the Eisenhower type of party, but also, if you push me, even the Ronald Reagan party in the 1980s certainly is very different from the the George Bush father type of party that elected him. So it's a funny transformation, but you have to bear in mind that this is not something that is just exclusive to the United States, that it is happening virtually across the board. You have, in some cases, where the situation is similar to that of the United States. That's the case of the US, the UK, where the Labour Party has been moving to the left, the Conservative Party has been moving to the right. And the funny thing that in a period in which you have seen a lot of crisis, especially in the north of England, the party that has lost out and has become the party of Londoners, of elite Londoners, has been a more left-wing Labour Party, whereas the north of England, the so-called Red Belt, has shifted, at least in the last election in 2019, in droves to the Conservative Party, that in theory represented the antithesis of what they stood for. This was, for heaven's sake, the party that with Margaret Thatcher, started the decline. Well, the decline was already there, and there would be a lot of discussion, but was responsible for the closing of the mines and of the steel mills of the north of England, that were the sign that there was a big decline and probably there was no return there. In other cases, like in Italy, like in France, like what might be happening, and let's see what happens in the case of Germany or in the case of Spain, what we are seeing is a real explosion of the traditional party system, in which either, like in the case of France or the case of Italy, both big parties, traditional big parties, blocks have completely disappeared, and what we have is something that is completely new. And in dynamism, mainly the cleavage is now between anti-system parties and pro-system parties. So that's the case of France. And in other cases, you have one party, the Christian Democrats in Germany, the Socialist Party in the case of Spain, that despite being weaker than they were, are the ones that remain in place. But especially Social Democrats in the case of Germany have been on the verge, and that might change, but have been on the verge of disappearance because of the impulse of let's say, anti-system parties from both left and right coming out in this new political spectrum.
Okay, and now the question from Przemysław Krawczyński.
So thank you for this lecture. My question is, what could be the possible effects of SARS-CoV pandemic on the model, short and long effects? I'm just thinking about some positive effects of pandemics in the past, like about the Black Death. We got the Renaissance, Reformation, so there was a move in the direction of more democratic. So this long effect could be after 3-5 years. But what do you think about short effects, and what are your thoughts?
Okay, Przemysław, I'm not sure thank you very much. I'm not sure I'm as optimistic as you are, and I cannot really talk about democratic regeneration. My research is mainly on regional development, but even on regional development there, I'm not very optimistic. I gave a talk precisely about this yesterday, on the idea that there has been talks that with the pandemic, with the hollowing out of cities, people leaving cities because they were perceived to be as the main focus of COVID-19, there was going to be an opportunity for revival of faraway places, of remote rural areas, that because we're all working remotely these days, that you can, instead of staying in Warsaw, you could just go to somewhere in the countryside in Lubielskie and do the same thing without having at much lower cost and contributing to the local economy. I'm not sure that's going to last, to be honest. It's true that remote work is here to stay, but it's not going to be remote work all the time. There's a lot of speculation about that, but what probably is we're going to end up with a system in which we shift from just having 5 to 10% of the population working remotely to having about 40% of the population working remotely. But this is not going to be, it will be 40% of hours, not 40% of the population, because we'll have mixed systems in which we'll be working in an office 2 or 3 days a week, depending, and then we can combine it with remote working. So it would mean less commuting, but you'll have to be close to the city. So if you're thinking that this is going to solve the problems of low development in Podkarpackie region, for example, and the whole eastern Poland, and is going to decelerate the steaming ahead of Warsaw, I'm not sure that's going to be the case unless you intervene actively to promote economic activity in those areas. Of course, Jurgos might not be completely happy with this point of view, and he has other views, I know, but this is a debate that we need to have, and it should be a very interesting debate, because I think that possibly, although the pandemic, and I highlighted yesterday, like you start, that previous pandemics have brought significant improvements in health regulation, in health provision, in the structure of our cities in the past, etc. And this might be the case with COVID-19. I'm not saying that the big transformation is going to be a transformation that's going to affect all spaces. There are going to be winners and losers, and the losers might be the same losers at the moment. I think that the main transformations are going to be happening within dynamic spaces rather than a switch to letting places that were declining become more dynamic.
I mean, some work could be back to states or to some else. We discovered that we need to have some European Union, or so in each country of European Union as well, some basic production infrastructure. So we cannot let our companies just to China or to other places to move.
No, certainly there's a big discussion now about the role of industrial policy, and that is going to change, absolutely.
Okay, so we have Alexandra Ćwik now.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask whether it is correct to draw a link between the resentment that you mentioned in the remote areas and the sort of vulnerability of American history. What I mean is that I've heard this saying that in Europe, 200 miles is a long distance, but on the other hand, in the US, 200 years is a long period of time, which means that American history is not, the American heritage is now going through some sort of a shift of paradigm. And we know that one of the most cultural institutions in the Smithsonian Museum of African History, whereas Alabama, for example, introduces the belt of civil rights history heritage. And I'm wondering whether it is not a mistake, sort of a mistake, to overlook the rural America heritage, the intangible heritage there, whether the resentment that you mentioned might be an aftermath of sort of negligence of the local culture and cultural wealth.
Well, thank you, Alessandra. I'm not sure I can give you an answer on that one. It's true that I was going to say Americans overlook their history. In fact, I'm not sure that Americans overlook their history, because they got a shorter history than Europeans. When you go to the United States, you see that in many communities, everything that can be preserved or is preserved. There has been significant destruction, and of course, they let cities fail much more than we do in Europe. But I'm not sure that there's an overlook of the history in the case of the US. And we also have the situation that this is not a phenomenon that's exclusive to a relatively new countries, not just countries in the New World. In fact, it's happening in the US, but it's not happening in Canada. We have seen it in Europe, that where in theory we have a far longer history, where in places where there's a very rich heritage, this is happening or raging in the same way or even a stronger way than what we're seeing in the case of the US. The fact that we might have a French Marine Le Pen, for example, or Marine Maréchal Le Pen as president of France, which was something that would have been unthinkable just 10 years ago, and now it's a very distinct possibility. And we're talking about one of the oldest countries in the world, and we don't have to go to, but since one of the 2 or 3 countries that has been existing in the same sort of form since the Middle Ages.
Okay, so now we have Robert Bench intervention.
Thank you very much. My question is, could Americans' voting preferences be reversed in times of widespread conspiracy theories on the internet, such as 5G conspiracies, or in the United States, QAnon, even if the pandemic would be followed by a strong economic growth that would resolve all economic problems in neglected regions? And how important...
Okay. No, go ahead.
How important to voters is the tradition and aversion to Democrats that make voters choose not a Republican but an anti-Democrat?
Okay. Thank you, Robert. Here, I'm going to try to reply in the same way as I did to the previous question. I don't think that, in my view, conspiracy theories are that fundamental. I mean, of course, there are a lot of conspiracy theories. There's a lot of misinformation. But I still think, first, that we have alternative sources of information. And I do think that the voters of these alternatives are doing it consciously. They are not stupid. They know what they're doing. And the main solution would be to go to the fundamentals. And there are 2 types of fundamentals. One is about identity. And the whole idea that there are a lot of people that are voting for these anti-system parties because they feel ill at ease with the countries in which we live in, and they are different from the countries in which they were born and they grew up, and they feel that they have lost their identity. There are commentators that say that they feel like strangers in their own land. And that might be a reason. I don't think that there's a possibility of going back, and it's not desirable to go back, but we need to find a better narrative about our countries. A narrative that is much more inclusive and that highlights that being American or being British or being Polish or being Italian is something that is different from the past, but is as good, if not better, than what we had before. And this is something that we have to work together collectively as a society. And at the moment, I think most societies are failing. The second one is about the economics. And here the economics is fundamentally about generating or being able to harness the local potential that most of these places have, therefore generating sustainable economic activity, which doesn't imply all the time just handouts. I would just say public policy sometimes works, most of the time it doesn't work very well. But giving the opportunities, given the conditions, given the right attention to make sure that the talent that is there is harnessed through greater connectivity, through greater accessibility, through greater mobility, through greater access to talent and to training and education, those might be factors that might work. But also providing that there's a minimum of adequate services that can service large swaths of the population, not just in very remote areas where it might be more difficult, but especially in medium and small sized cities and towns where those services have been declining for quite a long time, and where probably the cost of making sure that those services are delivered in a more widespread, but also nevertheless a cost-efficient way cannot be as high as trying to deal with the sort of mess that we have at the moment.
Okay, we still have 2 minutes, so I propose the last question, although I can see that the answer might be not very easy. So Wojciech Janicki, please ask the question.
Thank you for your inspiring, great lecture. Just let me start not with my question directly, but with some background. I'm from Lubelskia, which is southeastern part of Poland. When I look around, I see people who feel neglected. I see people who feel disdained, and I see people who feel that there are parties that would telling them that they are really great and this is the only reason why they vote for them. What I saw in your presentation, in your story, is that the America is kind of a mirror for Poland, because the story goes along the same way. And I listened to your answers to previous questions, and I know it is similar, but I would like to draw a conclusion. So not only to learn what are the patterns and so who votes for Trump, who doesn't, but how to change the direction the river flows. So how to make these people believe that if the money they are given doesn't help, like in the south of Italy, if you don't give them money, they are still unhappy. So how to make them happy without being a populist? Is there any answer?
I mean, thank you very much, Wojciech. I think that's a very interesting question. But first, I don't have the magic wand, but we can all speculate here. But I think we have to look at the places where this has been controlled, where there has been less of a discontent and type of reaction. Not all rural areas, not all declining areas, not all small towns and cities are discontent. No, not all of them are moving to, let's say, anti-system vote. And we have to look at places like, for example, central and northern Sweden, where you have small towns in relatively, especially in central Sweden, with high density, still voting for mainstream parties. We have to look at Germany, not East Germany, where there's widespread populism left and right. But you go to the south of Germany, and the fact is that prosperity is not related to the size of the city. It's not just Munich, or it's not just Stuttgart or Frankfurt. There's places like Ingolstadt, it's places like Augsburg, it's places like Regensburg, it's places like Tübingen, it's places like Eichstätt with 20,000 people. These are places that, despite being relatively remote, relatively small, they have industry, and industry that is competitive. That industry that has weathered the crisis much, much better than industrial districts, for example, in the case of Italy. So in that respect, what you have to look at what they have done, and they have done right. And very often, and even if you go to the Ruhr, which has been declining for quite some time, and what you have there is a much lower level of discontent than what you will find in, for example, declining north of France. And there would be a combination of more policy attention to the basics, let's say providing the right skills, just fundamental training, but also a lot on the job training, creating the conditions and the environment for local firms to be able to migrate in terms not to move to another place, but to increase the level of diversity and complexity. The work on related variety by evolutionary economic geographers is actually very, very important in this respect. And you also have to look at the role of institutions and how well institutions play a role in that. If the institutions that have been in place and have been doing the right sort of interventions for quite some time, if you have low levels of corruption, you have more transparency, you have more accountability, you have better access or more fluid connection to government decisions, then you're going to be happier and you're going to be able to provide more sustainable economic activity for your population. And this is something that is not completely radical. It's happening right now. And it's happening in many parts of Europe. But the problem is that in many other parts, there has been a complete neglect. If we take a look at what has been done at the level of many nation states, I'm taking the case of France, whereas the European policy, and of course in France there was not a lot of support from the cohesion policy, but the European policy focused on the least developed areas of the country. The national policy mainly concentrated in the core region, leading to a situation where in the last 30 years in France, the only region that has grown above the average, the national average, is the region of Île-de-France, the region of Paris. Once you have that, of course you're going to have discontent, because people are saying for decades and decades and decades, we're not moving out. We've just been given money, we've been given promises, but what has done, that has created more dependency, a dependent economy, a more sheltered economy, more protected, and no real future for not just for us, but for our children. Unless you address that, there's going to be no way that you're going to stem this rise of discontent. And we might end up in a few years with a much more different Europe than what we have now. And this, I'm talking just about Europe. And I'm afraid it's going to be a far worse Europe than anything that we had in the past, because there's nothing wrong with change and there are things that need to be changed. But when the change goes, and this is just a political rant, in the wrong direction to solutions that are going to create more conflict, that in many ways are going to have a much more fragmented society in Europe, in which some of the demons that we saw in the 1930s might come back. That is not the way forward. The go forward is that we have a system that has worked with all its problems. We should reform it, but make it better, not make it worse.
Thank you for the answer. I'm listening and hearing it as an answer. Take your future in your own hands.
Mm-hmm.
We are getting short of time, so perhaps we should not go into discussion now.
I don't know. Yes, we've run out of time. So thank you very much again, Andrés, to take part in this seminar, to give this great speech and answer also difficult questions and try to find out the solution for the places that don't matter. And next time, I also invite all of you. We'll continue the topic. We'll talk about white trash, and Małgorzata Durska from American Studies Center will tell us about her recent studies. So yes, thank you very much, Andrés, again.
Thank you very much, Agnieszka. Thank you very much, Diogo. Thank you very much, everyone, for bearing with me for more than an hour and a half at the moment. And hopefully we'll be able to see each other in person very, very soon. So enjoy.
Thanks a lot, Andrés, and hopefully we are going to meet sometime in the future. That's right. And let us keep healthy.